It was very interesting. The one suggestion that Nehru made, he said categorically that there simply was not the cinematic experience amongst Indian actors in the style of Western cinema rather than Indian cinema to allow me to cast an Indian actor. He just didn't think it was possible, and he said, I know exactly who you should cast, and that's Alec Guinness. And I said, well, sir, I will obviously bear your thoughts in mind, and Guinness is one of our great actors, but I would be uncomfortable at the idea of an Englishman, although it would make Gandhi laugh very much, I'm sure, browning up, as it were, to play such a figure. And although I talked to Peter Finch, to Johnny Hurt,
visita mi canal.
to Albie Finney, to Tony Hopkins, who went and lost, I think, 2.5 stone in order to play Gandhi. The actual choice of Gandhi was amusing in a way. My son is a director in the theatre. He runs the Almeida Theatre now in London, after having been at the RSC for some 10 or 12 years. And while at the RSC, he saw an actor who he said, Dad, if you don't test this man, you're out of your mind. His name is Ben Kingsley. You must come and see him, go and meet him, and so on and so on and so on. Oh, and by the way, he's half Indian. And my heart missed about 24 beats, and I went to see Ben. I tested Robert Downey for Charlie Chaplin, and Ben and Robert Downey are the only two actors I've ever tested in casting people in their first jobs, many of them, like Denzel Washington and so on. But I don't like testing. I think it's an uncivilized way of making a judgment about an actor's capability and performance. However, I did decide, because it was so fundamental, and to try and be sure that such a persona was acceptable as this remarkable figure. And we went to the studios, and I tested at the same time Johnny Hurt. And Johnny came out of his dressing room and was talking to somebody in the corridor, and Ben Kingsley came down the same corridor and walked past, didn't see John at all. And John stopped talking to who he was speaking to, turned to me and looked at Ben going down the corridor and said, I look like a second-row Welsh forward, he said. There is no way in which I could look at that man. That man is Gandhi. Don't bother to test me, please. He will be absolutely wonderful. And it was partly Johnny's generosity that I didn't go any further, and I did test Ben, and he was so immediately acceptable.
I'm glad to be home, and I thank you for your greeting.
He was absolutely brilliantly cast because he's half Gujarati himself. Kingsley is his mother's name. And Ben Kingsley, people think he's, totally British. Of course he's British, but the thing is he's also half Gujarati. And physically he so much like Gandhi. And he worked hard on it, and he did a brilliant job.
I stayed at the Ashoka Hotel. That was where our production base was. And right outside my office, I had a very large balcony. And Ben Kingsley moved into my balcony to start getting into the part of Mahatma Gandhi. And he wore the loincloth, and he spent his days on what they call a charpoy, which is a sort of string-covered bed. And he read just about everything he could read of Mahatma Gandhi and got into the life of the man.
He immediately went on the correct diets, eating only the vegetarian food, drinking goat's milk, living and wearing only Bapu's clothes, the dhoti and so on. The pigment of his skin, which had part Indian in it, he lay in the sun hour after hour until he made himself dark enough so he never had to wear makeup. He learned how to spin. He slept, I think, for something like 10 weeks, 12 weeks. He slept on the floor, so that it was not a series of mannerisms which he implanted externally as an actor. They emanated from an absolute belief that he was capable of understanding and presenting this character as himself. He listened. There was no question of him ever having to think of a Gandhi cadence in terms of the delivery of a line. He was incapable of playing the line in any way other than Gandhi's way. He knew exactly how Gandhi formed his sentences, what his hesitancies were, what his emphases were, etc.
The function of a civil resistor is to provoke response, and we will continue to provoke until they respond or they change the law. They are not in control. We are. That is the strength of civil resistance.
Ben was actually 36 or 37 when we shot the movie, and when he starts the movie, he's supposed to be 27 or so in South Africa. And then, of course, before his assassination, he's in his late 70s. And he was so much the age of the man that he was intended to be. And of course, a lot of this was to do with makeup. We had a marvellous makeup man called Tom Smith. And when Ben was playing the old man, he'd spend 2 or 3 hours in the makeup chair. And then he'd come out dressed onto the set to rehearse. And he was the old man in every respect. And I remember on more than one occasion, we'd rehearse. And I'd have to set up the track and the lights and the camera and everything. And I'd say to Ben, Ben, if you want to sit down for a little while, that's fine. I should be 10 minutes or so. And Ben would look at me and smile and sort of nod his head in that sort of typically Indian way. And of course, he was 36. And I was utterly convinced that I was in the presence of this very old, frail man who had to be looked after. And he stayed like that the whole day until he came out of makeup.
When he was when we do a crowd scene or something, people would touch his dhoti, people touch him on the feet and so on. He was so convincing to the Indian nation, as it were, that they took him unto themselves, and he was revered. I mean, he had to behave himself. He really was revered as this figure, which was an extraordinary thing.
If he, in the evening, after shooting, had a glass of beer, people were saying Gandhiji didn't drink beer. Mr. Kingsley mustn't be drinking beer. And it's quite a pressure to have on. Having that all the time must have been extraordinary, and he dealt with it absolutely brilliantly, because he was the embodiment of their Mahatma.
It was beyond acting, Ben, in Gandhi. It was a sort of transformation in a way. He became Mahatma Gandhi for the period of shooting the movie. And it was one of the most fortunate pieces of casting that I ever confronted. You are faced, of course, with a country of such scale compared to the UK that it's difficult really to take on board. Delhi and Calcutta and Rajasthan and Pune and Bombay, and all that were areas in which we had to work.
We started in Delhi, and we started in Delhi in November, so we were shooting throughout most of the winter in Delhi, and that was quite pleasant right up till the end of January, where we recreated the Gandhi's funeral. But of course, once moving 2 or 3 hours by plane south into Bombay, it's a tropical climate there, the heat started from that point on. And by the time we got to Putna in the back end of the movie, we're nearly at the end of the movie, well, we were dealing with temperatures of about 110 in the shade, and hard to work in those conditions.
I think, like everybody else, my first impression, all planes landed in the middle of the night, and you'd had this long journey, and the door opened, and it was like walking into an oven. And then you walked into the customs hall, and it was like, it was just mayhem. I mean, it took about 3 hours to find your bags, get through immigration, and get out the other side. And I fell in love with it immediately.
One of the great difficulties at that time, of course, transport was terrifying. I mean, to get a car to take you up over the mountains and so on was an enormous problem that you faced. You had to take 3 or 4 spare tires because the tires that you had were so worn out. You had to have the capability within 3 or 4 cars of having mechanics because the cars would break down all the time.
I think it was a masterpiece of production planning by the production office, because sometimes we'd be in one place with a cast of 5,000 for one day, with all the problems of transportation that there were in India. The roads just dreadful. And the next day we'd be on another location for a different scene with another large crowd. And so the logistics of doing all this were absolutely enormous.
It was always a challenge to, the logistics of shooting in India are not easy. The most important ally we had in India was Mrs. Gandhi herself, who knew Richard on a personal level. Without her support, we never could have made the movie. She was more than helpful. There was quite a big political move to stop the movie because a lot of Indians felt that Gandhi should have been made by an Indian company and Indian technicians and not by a foreign company. And she was sufficiently confident of Richard's abilities to get behind the movie. And she deflected all the political flack that came our way, and there were demonstrations and things like that in the streets that tried to stop the movie being made, and we were able to overcome it.
We were announcing that the film was going to be made with a huge press conference, more cameramen you've ever seen, I mean, extraordinary. And questions were asked, and people saying this is an outrage, under no circumstances should this film be made. Mahatma Gandhi was a holy man, and no other man could possibly play the part of Gandhi. He was the father of nations. And the woman right at the back said, he should be shown only as a moving light. And I said, Madam, I am not making a picture about bloody Tinkerbell. And of course it was a terrible thing, and very rude of me to say so. But that was one of the main oppositions.
The first day of shooting was a bit of a publicity nightmare because there was a lot of opposition to the film being made in India. And a former Prime Minister, Morarji Desai, had threatened to fast unto death if filming didn't stop. And this protest of his was taken up by other people, and we were told that on the first day of shooting we wouldn't get to the set to where we were it was a location, not a set. We wouldn't get there because there'd be so many people lying down to stop our vehicles getting there, and we'd have to drive over them to get there. So that was a bit of a worry, and in the event we turned up at dawn and there wasn't a soul there.
In the main, the overwhelming image that I have in my mind is of kindness and the hospitality and the interest and the sensible, sophisticated in a way, attitude towards making such a project was quite overwhelming. And right throughout the movie, officially we wanted the army, we wanted railways, we wanted anything we were given.
The first day of shooting, I remember it very, very clearly. we were shooting a scene of a strike, a march of strikers coming to a South African mine, and it was shot in the suburbs of Delhi. And of course, we're all highly excited on our first day of shooting. And when I arrived on the set and having my usual production chats with the first AD, I was horrified to learn that Richard hadn't arrived. And the whole crew is there, everybody is there, and Richard Attenborough is missing. And I couldn't believe it. David Tomlin, the late David Tomlin, probably the best first assistant ever in the game, was unworried about it because he knew something. And what I learned later was that Richard had decided that he would go to the monument, the place where Mahatma Gandhi was cremated. They have created a monument, and he went to that place on the first day of shooting, and he spent some quiet time there. I think probably communicating with the man himself, and he turned up about 3/4 of an hour late, and we never forgot the reason why.
I'm not a religious man, I'm an agnostic, I think. But in a strange way, I felt I wanted to cleanse my feelings, to conjure them and examine them, and spend a little time at this memorial that exists to him, to think about what he stood for and the responsibility that I was taking on in making this movie.
The first day of shooting, the first thing that happened was a religious ceremony with a Hindu priest. And we were all gathered there together, the whole unit. And this priest performed this ceremony of blessing the movie and going through all the rituals. And then we were all garlanded with marigolds before we started to shoot. It took quite a while because this couldn't be rushed. And of course, it obviously meant a great deal to the Hindu people. And that was an amazing way to start a film.
If you tried to tell on film the whole story of Gandhi, you'd need a 12-hour movie. And to condense what we did down to 3 hours was tough going. It was a huge project. Vast crowds were absolutely essential to it. You couldn't shoot this movie without producing the scale. I mean, you just wouldn't have done the subject justice.
When it came to having extras, because there were huge crowd scenes, we had about 200 people that had some acting experience, mainly in the Bombay film industry, and they were called the frontliners. They were the people who nearest the front, most noticed by the camera, and they had the best costumes and so on. But further back, there were thousands of people who were just local people who'd come in for a day's work. But of course, as soon as the word got that Gandhi was being shot and there was this man playing Gandhi, thousands of people would come and watch, and they'd watch from a distance for hours and hours.
The size of the crowds, actually the best aspect of the visual side of the film really, is the crowds are the landscape, the crowds are the architecture. In that sense, it doesn't have much to do with design, except hopefully we chose a theatre big enough to contain these enormous crowds and to set them off. I think we did. That, I suppose, is one of my kind of abiding memories, is that just the response from people who are not in the least bit jaundiced, who haven't seen it all before, who want to be there, who want to be a part of it, and came in their thousands, and actually in their hundreds of thousands. And it's such a feature of the film. It doesn't date, it's an aspect of the film that doesn't date, that impresses now, impressed then 25 years ago, impresses now, and will impress forever, I'm sure.
The Salt March was, again, there were thousands of people who came when we started to assemble the march, and we announced where the march, although Ben didn't go the whole way by any means, he walked a long way And we gathered people, hundreds of people, and some thousands, who marched with him finally down onto the beach and down to the sea. The remarkable thing was, I don't remember anybody causing problems. Nobody protested, nobody was uncooperative in terms of what we wanted and we required at that particular time, in those particular circumstances. In fact, I was quite bewildered by it.
It's very interesting how we got the crowd for the Salt March, because we wanted a crowd of 5,000, and we were shooting it in a coastal region which was largely Roman Catholic. And so I don't know who it was, but somebody went to the local Catholic priest and said, you know, can you get 5,000 people for you for these scenes, you see? And he agreed and went about it, and the arrangement was that instead of paying these people, the production gave several £1,000s to create 2 new classrooms for the local school. So that was a really nice thing to do, and that you know, we got the crowd, and you know, we did some good with the money.
Man needs salt as he needs air and water. This salt comes from the Indian Ocean. Let every Indian claim it as his right.
I've never worked such long hours in such tough conditions. We would go out before dawn to be on location at dawn. We would shoot till sunset, and I'd think, oh good, we're going to stop now, but he'd have saved up a couple of shots, close-ups that he could do with lights. Practically every location was an hour away from the hotel. Some were 2 hours' drive. We'd come back, we'd have these meetings, because there'd be questions in the Lok Sabha about, you know, why was India doing this, that and the other, and helping the film. And then we had 1 day off a week, and we worked on that day doing various meetings and preparations. How Dick did it, I do not know, because he was always on his toes, always on top of it, never bad-tempered, always full of energy. It was totally amazing.
I have the utmost admiration for Dickie, because he was absolutely tireless. I've never worked with a director with so much energy. What was amazing is that he was wearing so many hats, because he wasn't only the director, he was also the producer. But he had all these political problems going on in the background. I mean, he'd have to disappear sometimes during the day and go to meet the Minister of Culture or the Minister of Information and kind of face up to all that sort of thing, as well as all the responsibilities on set. And of course, we didn't have such good communication in those days. You used to get messages by telex. So he was up at all hours of the night.
Well, he was on top of his form. He thrives on difficulty, or seems to. Doesn't seem to bother him. It's water off a duck's back. It can't be really, but that's how he plays the hand. And he hasn't got a lot of time. The schedule is very tight. But he's always so warm, so human, so kind. I'm not flattering him in any way. He is these things. He's human and kind and totally professional.
Making movies is 95% hard work and sweat. I mean, I get up normally when I'm shooting at, if we have a trip to a location, 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, and you rarely get back to go to bed much before 11 because you've got rushes and so on, dailies to see. And if that goes on for 10 weeks, well, okay, but if it goes on for 20 or 30, even when I was considerably younger, it is very exhausting. And I think, therefore, almost inevitably at the end of any movie, but of Gandhi in particular, there was a feeling of emotional exhaustion too. One wondered whether one could ever summon up the strength and the commitment to do anything such as that again. And physically, one was actually tired to the extent of almost not feeling you can stand up. And it was very distressing too, because you had lived with X number of people, both in front and behind the camera, for that number of months, and they became family.
Our last shots in India were in Udaipur, which is a desert region, and by that time, of course, again, we were dealing with temperatures in excess of 100, 110 in the shade. But everybody was pretty exhausted by that time, and despite the fact that you know you've got something special, you're all looking forward to getting home, because I personally had been there 8 months non-stop, and I had a young family at the time, and you're kind of keen to get to the end of the road so that you can draw breath and actually start to enjoy your life again. But of course, when it comes to the actual end, you are sad to leave. Any great crew, this was a fantastic crew, really some top-class people, and it was sad to say goodbye, because as it is in the movie business, your chances of working with a lot of these people again are fairly slim.
I think films become great adventures because we need we employ local people, we have big building projects and so on, become, for maybe 6 months before the start of shooting, very involved with the location, with the place. Films become great adventures. But Gandhi is the single best adventure that I ever had, really, and has become the benchmark ever since for me, really. And I kind of measure everything against that standard, and it was the most stimulating. Both India, the country, rich in culture, fascinating, but the film itself, of course, as I say, the standard by which all others are measured.